welcome to the Bible Made Clear. So today we're going to look at the Old Testament book of Judges. It comes right after the book of Joshua and really talks about the deterioration of the next generation as they had entered into the Promised Land and how they didn't really possess the Promised Land the way that God had intended them to. We learn that in the first few chapters of the book of Judges. So the basic overview, we need to connect Judges to Joshua. They go from victory to defeat. And the book of Joshua ended with Joshua passing the baton to the next generation, and then he died. So it says at the end of Joshua, now it came to pass after these things that Joshua the son of Nun, the servant of the Lord, died, being 110 years old. So Joshua goes to his death. There was no individual leader to pass the baton on to. So Judah, the lead tribe, took this lead in Judges chapter 1. So the problem, let me slide this over here. The problem of the next generation is indicated really before Judges starts back in Joshua. So in Joshua 24:31, it says, Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had known all the words of the Lord, which he had done for Israel. So Joshua and those that served under him, while they were alive, things were fine. It was after that that things began to really deteriorate. So this is the first time this is actually mentioned, but it's mentioned a second time at the beginning, really, of chapter 2, or midway through chapter 2 in the book of Judges. So the two phrases in Judges, which indicate really the condition of Israel and the background to which the book is set against, is seen here. So we see in Judges chapter 1, verses 19, 21, 27, 28, 29, 30, 31, 32, 33, we have this repetition of the phrase, they could or did not drive out the enemy from within the land of Israel. So as Joshua had established the geography of which each tribe would have, as they needed to root out those that were in the land, they were unable to drive them out, or they just could not or did not. And they ended up just basically taking taxes from them and settled it there. It was definitely a deterioration, certainly not what God was looking for. And then in chapter 17, verse 6, 18:1, 19:1, and 21:25, which is the last verse in the book of Judges, it says, in those days there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in their own eyes. So the first and the last verse, 17:6 and 21:25, are exactly the same. The in-between verses just give us the indication that there was no king in Israel. So this background will provide some context for some of the terrible acts of some of the judges in the nation. We need to understand that they are part of this culture which was already deteriorated. So the basic overview in the book of Judges, continuing on, Israel obviously was unwilling to obey and drive out the Canaanites, so God would not let them have a complete victory. In Judges 2:3, it says, therefore I also said, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall be thorns in your side, and their God shall be a snare to you. And this was the means of God bringing upon them, for their disobedience under the Mosaic covenant, the chastisement, so that they would learn that they needed to trust God. It was after the Lord told them they were not keeping the Mosaic covenant that they were under, that they had this judgment. So Joshua knew clearly that obedience was the pathway to blessing. We see that in Joshua chapter 1. And now that he was gone, unfortunately, so wasn't Israel's obedience. So Israel quickly fell into idolatry, and this resulted in the cursing that we see back that Moses said would happen in Deuteronomy 27 and 28 for their disobedience under the law. So in Judges 2, 11, 13, 14, and 15, it says, Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals and Ashtoreth, so that they could no longer stand before their enemies. And obviously, they couldn't stand before their enemies because God would not allow them to have the strength in their disobedience. So he goes on, he says, Whenever they went out, the hand of the Lord, interesting, was against them for calamity, as the Lord had said, and as the Lord had sworn to them, and they were greatly distressed. So then we find after that, this is exactly what Joshua had warned them about previous. Joshua says in chapter 23, which is the beginning of his farewell address, he says, Therefore take careful heed to yourselves that you love the Lord your God, or else, if indeed you do go back and cling to the remnant of these nations, these that remain among you, and make marriages with them, and go into them, and they to you, know for a certain that the Lord your God will no longer drive out these nations from before you, but they shall be snares and traps to you, and scourges on your sides, and thorns in your eyes, until you perish from this good land which the Lord your God has given you. So this should be no surprise to Israel that they would fall under this judgment, because Joshua had warned them. Though after the warning that Joshua gave them in chapter 24 of Joshua, it does say that they said, no, we're going to obey God. Don't worry about it. But that didn't end up being the case. So Joshua prophetically anticipated their failure and warned them of the consequences. In Joshua 23:16, it says, When you have transgressed the covenant of the Lord your God, which he commanded you, and have gone and served other gods and bowed down to them, then the anger of the Lord will burn against you, and you shall perish quickly from the good land which he has given you. So this goes back to the covenant again in Deuteronomy, where Moses said in chapter 28, verse 63, And it shall be that just as the Lord rejoiced over you to do good and multiply you, so the Lord will rejoice over you to destroy you and bring you to nothing, and you shall be plucked from off the land which you go to possess. So again, this was all laid out clearly ahead of time for them. How was Israel governed during this self-destructive period? God raised up leaders called judges to deliver Israel. So this is what it says in Judges chapter 2 about them. The Lord raised up judges who delivered them out of the hand of those who plundered them. They would not listen to their judges, but they played the harlot with other gods and bowed down to them. They turned quickly from the way in which their fathers walked in obeying the commandments of the Lord. They did not do so. And when the Lord raised up judges for them, the Lord was with the judge and delivered them out of the hand of their enemies in all the days of the judge. For the Lord was moved to pity by their groaning because of those who oppressed them and harassed them. And it came to pass, when the judge was dead, that they reverted and behaved more corruptly than their fathers by following other gods to serve them and bow down to them. They did not cease from their own doings, nor from their stubborn way. So we see this pattern that is developed within Israel in their disobedience. And so this period of the judges was a time where God was trying to keep them on track by raising up people. But these people that God raised up, we'll see, are part of the people within this deterioration of Israel spiritually. So let's take a look at what the cycle looks like for the nation. So we see Israel disobeys God. This is the cycles that we find in Judges. And then Israel will be oppressed by their enemy. They'll cry out to God for relief, and then God will raise up a judge or a deliverer to deliver them. Then Israel will be delivered by the judge. They'll be at peace for a while, and then they'll go back and disobey God again. So this happens 7 times. There are 7 cycles in the book of Judges, and then there are 13 judges in all. So if we categorize the cycles, we'll take a look at the cycle, the oppressor, the oppressed, the judge that God raises up, and then the length of time that peace is provided. So the first cycle, we see the king of Mesopotamia is the one that oppresses them. That happens for 8 years. Othniel is the first judge, and then after he delivers Israel, they have peace for 40 years. The second cycle is from Eglon, the king of Moab, and he oppressed them for 18 years. We read over this, but that's a long time. Ehud, the left-handed man, he ends up being their deliverer, and then they have peace for 80 years. So we have Shamgar as the next judge, but we're not given a lot of information other than he killed 600 Philistines with an animal poking device, which is quite a feat. God was obviously with him to deliver Israel, but it's not giving us another cycle in this revision here. So the number of years that they were at peace based on that are not, there's none tied to Shamgar. He's just mentioned. But the third cycle, the king of Canaan, Jabin, he oppressed them for 20 years, and then Deborah with Barak ended up delivering them, and then they had peace for 40 years. The fourth cycle, the Midianites came down against them. They oppressed them for 7 years. And then Gideon, he delivered them. He was used by God during that time, and they had a 40-year rest. The fifth cycle was the destruction through Abimelech, who was a child of Gideon's concubine. And then they had 3 years of oppression. Tola and Jair are the ones that did the delivering, and then they had 23 and 22 years of peace respectively from them. The sixth cycle was the Ammonites that came down, another 18 years of oppression. Jephthah, he's the one that did the foolish vow, and then we have 6 years of peace from Jephthah. And then we have the same problem with the Ammonites, and then as a deliverer, we see Isbin gives them 7 years, again with the Ammonites. Elon, he gives them 10 years, and then again with the Ammonites, Abdon gives them 8 years. And then finally, the seventh cycle with the Philistines, 40-year oppression. And then Samson is raised up. I think we're all familiar with Samson, and then 20 years of peace from that. So these are the big 6 judges. The ones that everybody knows about. They're the main ones, actually, that lay out the book. We have Othniel, Ehud, Deborah, Gideon, Jephthah, and Samson. So Othniel was Caleb's brother's son. He was filled with the Holy Spirit, and he delivered Israel. It was pretty much a straightforward deliverance. Afterwards, we find Ehud. He was a left-handed man. He made himself a large double-edged knife that he used to kill Eglon with. He told Eglon that he had a secret and a gift for him, and so he wanted to talk to him in private. So Eglon put out his guards, and then because Ehud was left-handed, they checked. Everybody typically was right-handed, so they checked the wrong side. So when they did their security check, they didn't realize he had, a dagger, or probably a good-sized knife, on his right side that he could draw from. So if he drew crossbody or vice versa. So he used that to kill Ehud. And then Deborah. Deborah was a prophetess that God spoke through, but she wasn't a warrior. She needed Barak for that work. So God used 2 people to do the work of one. God used another woman named Jael to kill King Sisera, who was actually the one that led the army that Deborah and Barak needed to defeat. So in that work, we see that um, again, the delivering that was done was by the power of God, and God using these people that are just almost regular everyday people with many flaws. Um, Next, we see Gideon. Gideon was a nobody from the tribe of Manasseh that God used to reduce an army of 32,000 Israelites to 300 to defeat 135,000 Midianites. Um, and God did this because he knew that if he used any more than 300, the spiritual condition that Israel was in, they would have taken credit for it. So unfortunately, at the end of Gideon's life, he made a golden ephod, and people ended up idolizing that, and it became an idolatry in Israel. Definite problem. Jephthah was a child of a harlot and a cast off of society, but he was tough. When Israel needed deliverance, the same people that threw him out of town basically promoted him to fight their battles. And after his victory, he made a foolish vow, which was very unfortunate for him. And finally, we see Samson. Samson was a Nazarite from birth, but never respected the call on his life. He did what he wanted and disregarded his relationship to God. This was his ultimate downfall, and he died doing what he should have lived doing. Unfortunately, the story of Samson. So, what we learn from the book of Judges, first of all, with these six, all the judges were called and anointed by God to deliver Israel of some enemy's oppression. And this is important to see, that Israel was being delivered by these people, even though they weren't perfect. Secondly, each judge was increasingly flawed in their personal character. Now, this was reflective of the nation's condition spiritually. The increasingly flawed judges reveal how low the spiritual temperature of the nation's culture was, and then God delivered his people when they cried out because of his conditional covenant with them. God would not forsake Israel because of his unconditional covenant with Abraham. The conditional covenant under the Mosaic law enabled God to respond as they cried out to him. So it was unusual for God to use a woman to deliver Israel, for example, but his covenant to Abraham meant that he would use whoever he could to make sure Israel wasn't utterly destroyed by their enemies. He needed to make sure that that Abrahamic covenant was fulfilled. It was unusual for God to use a man filled with fear to fight an unwinnable battle. Right? We see that with Gideon. But this glorifies God, and during those low spiritual conditions, prevented Israel from taking credit. Interestingly enough, in the New Testament, Paul the Apostle, in 1 Corinthians 9, talks about how the Corinthians were so carnal, they thought Paul was a second-rate apostle because the false teachers had come in and told them that, well, Paul doesn't take money from you because he doesn't really have the authority, and Paul's really not one of the original 12, and so he doesn't really have the authority to do that and everything. And Paul corrected them, 1 Corinthians 9, and basically let them know that the reason he wasn't taking any financial support from them was because they were so carnal that any success in his ministry they might have taken to themselves and not given God the glory. So it's interesting how people need to be dealt with when they are at a low spiritual condition. Eighth, it was unusual for God to use a rogue outlaw like Jephthah to save his people, but God can use the abilities of a man. Yet that doesn't mean that the man personally benefits from God's working through him. You know, oftentimes we see it even within churches where God will provide opportunity for people equally to get involved in church work and to serve him, but yet that does not guarantee that God will work in that person's life if they decide that they don't want to walk with the Lord anymore or walk by faith. So God does not owe anything. God is not a debtor to man. So we owe everything to him. And it's important that we understand that, so that if we do serve the Lord and we are allowed to get involved in the work of God, that's a privilege that we enjoy. And it's a privilege that God allows us to have. At the same time, we need to realize that we need to remain faithful in walking with the Lord. Otherwise, that privilege can go away rather quickly. And I've seen it happen time and time again. Number 9, it was unusual for God to use a self-centered, disrespectable, arrogant, and immoral Nazarite um, like Samson, but God anointed him from his birth and always fulfills his promises to deliver, even if the deliverer he uses is not personally benefited by being used or is self-destructive in the end, as we see with Samson. And finally, the ultimate lesson is God will use whoever he chooses to further his redemptive purposes in the world, whether or not the vessel is willing or unwilling to do it with spiritual integrity or not. God has used many vessels that uh, do not personally benefit from the work that's done. And we see it time and time again. I mean, look what God brought through Israel. I mean, Israel was not necessarily a faithful nation, but yet God brought his word through them. He worked his covenants and promises through them, brought the Messiah through them, and all while they fought him half the time in doing it. So we see that all the time. If God was not merciful and gracious and long-suffering, he couldn't use people. I mean, it just wouldn't be something that could occur. So the logical layout of Judges is like this. First, Gideon is the pivot point of the Judges. He's the first judge to have um, spiritual deterioration that was manifested in his position as a judge over Israel. The judges prior to him did not really show that. This chiasm will show the pivot point of Gideon's ministry. So we have an introduction to the spiritual condition in Judges 1. We saw that. In Judges 2, the need for raising up judges or deliverers, which God does. And then next we have the first notable judge in Othniel in chapter 3. We see Ehud delivers them, the second notable judge, also in chapter 3. Deborah with Barak, third notable judge, chapter 4 and 5. And then Gideon in chapter 6. He's the fourth judge. But notice, Gideon is where the deterioration begins in the judges themselves as manifested, because something negative is brought out about Gideon, which was he had made that golden ephod and then people started to worship it. Toler and Jair, they're the next judges. Not much is said about them. Jephthah, obviously, he's the fifth notable judge. And Jephthah making the foolish vow to offer a burnt offering of what came out of his home first. Now, it was his only child, which is his daughter. Some people think he actually offered her as a burnt offering. I would personally lean towards the fact that he offered her in perpetual virginity. I think the text bears that out, but we're not going to argue that here. And then finally, Samson, who had the biggest deterioration of all the judges, the sixth notable judge, where he just had an entire life basically almost in rebellion against God, or just fought everything that God was doing in his life, and yet God still used him to deliver Israel from the Philistines, but unfortunately he died in the end, doing what he should have been doing living. So the manifestation of a deteriorated spiritual nation then we see in chapters 17 to 19, and then the last few chapters the need for a unified nation. So the book of Judges lays out, interestingly, in this chiasm, which basically gives you kind of a balanced look at the book, with Gideon being the pivot point within the entire book itself. So we can apply uh, this from the Judges because we want to make application. So with each of these notable judges, we see first Othniel. He learned the value of faith and trust in God from his uncle Caleb. He wanted the benefits and blessings of the land God promised to Israel, and God used men who trust him and his promises. So Othniel was kind of a pretty straightforward guy, closest to the old regime with Joshua and Caleb. And so he was probably living under that perspective of faith and trust in God. Ehud, similarly, it says Ehud was used, right? But he used what was considered a kind of handicap to defeat the enemy. Being left handed was considered a disadvantage, and God uses our weaknesses for his glory. So we shouldn't look at the weaknesses we have. Um, we should look at Ehud's life and say, well, God can use my weaknesses, my handicaps, or the things that others look at that make me different. So Othniel shows us that faith and trust in God is key, because that's the people God uses. Ehud shows us that God will use our weaknesses and what other people consider a disadvantage or something that's not natural. Deborah was in a culture of men who were not stepping up to fill the need to deliver Israel. So she was not a warrior, but she knew one who was an enlisted barrack. So God uses women as well as men to accomplish his purposes. Now, I know people have used Deborah as the model of serving women, but she's not really the model. She's actually what is not typical um, within the realm of women serving. Women should not need a lack of men in order to serve the Lord properly, especially in the church. Deborah is not a model for church service. Deborah is a woman that found herself in the midst of a culture of men that were afraid to do what they needed to do and step up in faith. So we don't want to use that kind of a model in church, because then we have to get rid of a bunch of faithful men so that we can have women serve. And that's not really glorifying to the Lord Jesus Christ. And that's not how the New Testament tells us that the church method is supposed to be done. So, however, it does encourage us that God is not interested whether we are men or women. He just wants people to be able to trust him and step forward. Gideon had fear, which a lot of people have, and would never consider himself capable of delivering Israel. And God uses the least likely to accomplish the greatest victories because they don't take the credit. And that's so important. There's so many people today that are taking all the credit for what God does. Unfortunately, we're at a time in our culture, in the church, where in order to be notable or have an impact, you have to have celebrity status. And that's very unfortunate, because it discourages so many people from serving the Lord, and they start to view service the same way that the world views notoriety. And oftentimes, serving God can get confused. We draw a lot of the cultural norms into the church, a lot of um, the perspectives that the culture has as far as value and importance and significance and all that for impact, instead of doing things God's way. But unfortunately, that's the way it is. And in doing that, there's a lot of men and women that are taking credit through their celebrity status, and unfortunately are a lot larger in their own eyes than they should be. But that's something that God will sort out in the end. Jephthah, he had no cultural, national, or spiritual advantage being the son of a harlot, but the one thing he did have is courage. So God uses those who will engage the enemy on his behalf but we don't need to vow foolishly, obviously, in doing it. So we can we can serve God. We don't have to have a cultural or national or spiritual advantage in order to do that. May be a nobody from Nowheresville. That doesn't matter. God knows we're alive, and if we can trust Him and offer ourselves to Him, He will use us, and we don't have to make any foolish vows to get that done. Samson, he was an example of God's faithfulness to Israel and His promises to both a man and a nation. Now, Samson could have personally benefited greatly from God's hand on him, but he didn't figure that out until it was too late. Realize it and learn the lesson now, that when God puts His hand on you to use you, then you can personally benefit from it. But we need to remain faithful. Paul talked about doing ministry properly. Playing by the rules in a sense, when he talked to the Corinthians again, trying to help them understand that at the end of chapter 9, 1 Corinthians 9. So that's the book of Judges. I hope that it was instructive. It's a great book for just personal application. The principles in it are just so not only encouraging, but insightful. And so may God continue to bless you, I pray, and may He richly bless you as you continue to study His Word.